Thanks, Carl. Good morning, everybody. So the last time I did a keynote, I was in New Orleans, and I can assure you the 8 a.m. session would have been much more sparsely attended, and no one would have looked quite as fresh and eager as you all look today. So thank you for enjoying breakfast and coming along this morning and joining us. So I'm going to talk about what I hope is an extension of some of the subject matter we heard yesterday from Thomas Fry and Juan Vela, who were both part of the keynote sessions yesterday. But we're going to go a little bit deeper in terms of some of the trends in the industry and how they are leveraging data and analytics to help drive business decision making. Thanks for the introduction, Carl. I'll just fill in the gaps a little bit. I've been in the United States about 20 years. You may have guessed I'm not from Oklahoma. I'm originally from Scotland. Scotland is famous for giving the world 3 great gifts: whiskey, golf, and redheads. So I recommend them all, but not all at the same time. There are some redheaded Scots people in the room, actually, as we say that. So I'm going to talk, as I said, about using data in your business. As I mentioned, I've been in the technology industry for about 20 years. I moved to Silicon Valley in '99 with Sun Microsystems. I am not a data scientist. I am not exactly qualified to come up and talk to you about big data and analytics and some of the theory about that. But I have been very fortunate to have spent most of my career in organizations that are very data-driven. And I'm very fortunate now to work with service providers of all shapes and sizes, from the smallest rural cooperatives, electric co-ops, all the way up to large national and international carriers that are also very data-driven and are looking to see how they can apply data and analytics into their business decision-making processes and into their daily execution activities. And so a lot of the content we'll look at today will start with the big picture theory of big data and how it's applicable to all of you. But we'll actually get down into the weeds a little bit, into some specific data models and data sources that service providers, again, of all descriptions, are using to help drive their business. When I talk about driving their business, there's really, and I think in talking to Carl in preparation for the show this week, the big thing I'm going to focus on is your customer experience, so subscriber experience. And I think the reason many of you have already made the decision to go into the broadband delivery business or are thinking about it is because you have customers who have unrequited needs. And at the end of the day, that frustration is leading to the disruption opportunities. And so that when you get to the point that you're actually delivering those services, it's really important that you're leveraging the appropriate data and the appropriate reporting and analytics to ensure that that mission is being fulfilled. And I'll actually show you some examples of how service providers are mining data that historically they would not have to be able to deliver a better subscriber experience. So let's start at the very high level. So data analytics is the science, predominantly, of drawing insights from raw information sources. You'll see I put art there, and art is really important because it's the artistic side that is the imagination of the artistic side that allows us to fulfill the reality of the data. So if we can't think of the possibility of how data can be applied in our business, then we don't know which questions to ask the scientific component. So it's really important, and one of the best things I see every day as I work with service providers is the creative way that they start to think about solving problems. And it's very artistic or very responsive to things that are happening at an emotional level with their customers and their desire to respond to that. So we'll walk a little bit through through that continuum here. There was a lot of this content in Thomas's presentation yesterday. The big data has been around for a long time now. It's probably 20 years old in terms of from a conceptual level. And actually, as you go from the outside of these concentric rings to the middle, I think what we saw yesterday was this concept of deep learning really is where a lot of the growth and development is taking place right now. We saw the analogy of the robot is listening, the robot's learning, and we saw the little Alexa device. Well, in reality, that's true. That device is learning every day about the things you like to know about, your preferences, your behaviors. It's responding to you, and it's learning over time. I think we saw another example about the breakthrough game that in just a matter of 4 hours or so, the computer had managed to determine the optimal strategy to beat the game. Not just survive, but to actually beat the game and actually optimize. So really a lot of the work today is not just going on around the collection and organization of data, but it's really around how do we automate the machine learning and AI capability so that we reduce the need for human intervention. It may seem like a stretch, but there are already many service providers that are leveraging this type of capability in their day-to-day transactions with their customers. They have either already deployed applications that are leveraging AI capability, or they are using machine learning to improve the way that they are thinking about using data. The reality is there are a lot of buzzwords here. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be a data scientist to be able to start leveraging some of this information. The reality is, and I think the other piece that Thomas talked about yesterday was this, the piece I wrote notes about was the 1 trillion sensor man, that there'll be a trillion sensors in the world by the year 2022, and I think 100 trillion by 2035. That is a staggering number. If you put that also in conjunction with the number of connected devices and the growth in that space, the reality is there is so much data out there today, and it is coming from lots of different sources. So if we just look at this, this kind of ecosystem here, we've got on the outside applications, right? And the reality is there's a lot of information that's captured in applications inside CRM, inside billing systems. There's a lot of information being captured today about content that subscribers are consuming. So there's a lot of information from Google Analytics that's available. Netflix has information. LinkedIn will sell you information. And then as you continue to move into that, closer to the subscriber, it's the devices that they are consuming content over. You can see in our little pictogram here, we've got sensors, we've got handheld devices, and even the car that we talked about yesterday. So there's a huge amount of information flowing across your networks. The reality is, as a service provider, you are in a unique position, and a very strategic one, in terms of you are the only person that actually sees all this information flowing across your infrastructure. Not one of these giants in the data industry, Amazon, Google, Facebook, see everything. They only see the little slither of information that's flowing across networks that belongs to them. Now, the reality is, as service providers, you could actually see it all. And that puts you in a unique and strategic place in terms of your ability to respond to the needs of your subscribers over time. And we'll kind of dig into that a little bit more here. Carl asked me to look at, hey, what's going on, what are the big things going on in the industry right now as well? And this was an announcement that came out last week. This was Salesforce, who are the world's #1 CRM platform, acquired Tableau. Tableau are essentially a data analytics and data visualization company. They paid $15.8 billion for that acquisition. The reality is, for full disclosure, Calix, we're a Salesforce customer. We use Salesforce for everything. We use Salesforce for CRM. It's our ticketing system. We use it as a marketing platform. It's fully integrated. Any of you who happen to be a Calix customer today, we have a 360 view of our relationship with you through that tool. The reality is that we have to invest quite a lot to extract the data to make it useful for us today, and we have a dedicated team that already do that for us. The acquisition of Tableau means that companies like Calix no longer need to make those investments, because Salesforce have realized they're not just an application company now, they're actually a data company. And in order to maximize the value of their solution to us, they need to show us how to get the data out and show us how to make sure that that is being used in our business decision-making process. Even scarier acquisition, Google and Looker. So this acquisition closed maybe even earlier this week, the end of last week. Looker is like the hotshot analytics company in the Bay Area right now. They have raised about $300 million of private equity money today. They just passed $100 million revenue run rate which basically means they did their first $25 million revenue quarter last quarter, and they just got acquired for $2.8 billion, which is frightening for me because think about all the investment that Google's made in data over the last 20 years. And the reality is they and their Google Cloud strategy has fully realized that in order to leverage the value of the data in cloud for their customers, they need a front end that allows customers to interact with the data in a more meaningful way. So that's kind of a high-level view of the market. A little bit about this concept or this journey that you might go down from an analytics perspective. So we talked about analytics and data being the transformation of data from a raw source. If you imagine that bottom left corner here is raw data, there's a continuum, and this is actually a concept that has been developed and has been presented by Gartner over the last 15 years, about 5 years. And there is a continuum in the analytics realm, right? So there's this notion of, I've got some data, I've organized it, I've collected it, I'm presenting it, but it's backward looking, it's descriptive. It's telling me what happened, and so we'll look at an example in terms of from a customer. Perhaps I might want to understand who was a customer of mine and who's now left, who's churned out of my business. So that's a very descriptive set of data. I have a report that shows me all the people that left in the last month. What I might want to know is why did they leave, though? What happened that caused them to leave? Because churn is a really bad metric for me to be concerned about in my business. So the insight I want to go look at, or the insights I want to start to build is, what is it that causes customers to want to leave my service offering? And then going beyond that, I want to know, what will happen in the future? So what will happen if I take no action? So what is the outcome if I do nothing and let them just proceed down a path? What is the likely outcome? And then ultimately, what I want to be able to do is control the outcome. So I want to understand what is the action that I can take as a service provider that will prevent a customer from potentially leaving my service. And the earlier I can do that in the process, the more positive the outcome will be. And that's for 2 reasons. If I can intercept a customer's needs early in the process, because they change over time, right? I think we all understand that people's bandwidth needs change as they add devices, and kids come home from school, or they come home from college, and suddenly there's a proliferation of new devices in a home. That's going to drive up the bandwidth requirements and the Wi-Fi coverage needs inside a premise. So the reality is I want to be able to predict when my customer will run out of bandwidth, run out of speed, run out of Wi-Fi coverage, before they realize that they have. If I do that, their experience on my infrastructure is going to be better, my NPS score is going to be better, and ultimately the lifetime value of that customer is going to be higher than it would be if I have to spend money to retain them because they're having a bad experience. So there's a continuum, and actually we're going to talk about, we're going to look at some examples of descriptive information that customers or service providers are using today, and then what is some of the descriptive and what is some of the prescriptive. I'm going to use one last analogy or metaphor before we jump into some real service provider examples. I'm going to talk about Netflix. I think everyone is familiar with Netflix. I would be surprised if almost everybody in the room did not have a Netflix subscription or had a family member that used Netflix. They are a disruptor in the market. We heard that from Thomas yesterday, and Juan about these micro industries. So online streaming didn't exist, 10 years ago. It's a brand new category. And so they were first to market, and really, they were the death of Blockbuster. But they use data all the time. They have a lot of information about their subscribers, the types of content, the amount of time viewers are spending on their application. And so they have a lot of information, right? So I'm going to talk about the House of Cards. This is clearly the House of Fallen Cards at this point. For those of you who are familiar with this show, it was launched in 2013. It was Netflix's first big bet in generating its own content. The over-the-top service providers have realized that if they don't have unique, viable content, it's always going to be very difficult for them to compete with traditional cinema viewers and to compete with traditional broadcast media from a content perspective. The cable companies have done a really good job of getting their arms around a lot of content that subscribers want. And clearly, from an industry perspective, the movie industry has got no interest in pushing brand new content around the channel that they have today. So as part of this disruptive wave at Netflix, they decided, and they were the first one to go all in on developing new content. But this was a $100 million bet in terms of going and developing content. So before they went into this, they actually decided they would take a very data-driven approach to this. And they did three things. They looked at three core elements as they decided which content to develop first. They looked first at, okay, what is content that is very popular? And the metric that they used was completion rates. So how many viewers who start watching an individual show finish watching the show, and what percentage of those viewers watch every show and every episode, and then ultimately in each season. And the most popular season they found, popular content they found in all of their library was actually this show called House of Cards. It was originally produced by the BBC in the UK, and it was streamed over Netflix. And they found that this was the most popular show in terms of completion rate that they had from an American audience perspective, not a UK audience, on content that they were distributing over Netflix. Second piece was David Fincher. You may know him from films like Fight Club, Social Network, the movie Seven. He was one of the most popular directors on Netflix content that was part of their portfolio today. So of Netflix subscribers that watched movies, David Fincher was one of the top 3 directors, and the one that they could get to work with them as a non-traditional content producer. And then the final one was Kevin Spacey, obviously popular actor. We now know he's more of a bad actor, but he was one of the highest rated actors on Netflix as well. So films that had featured him had the highest viewing rates of content on Netflix. So they essentially took these 3 components and they said, let's put them together and let's develop content based on these 3 components. And obviously it was a huge success. I think it's won multiple Golden Globes and Emmys and all sorts of awards. From a viewership perspective, it clearly brought in new subscribers into Netflix. But they did not stop there. So they said, okay, that's great. Now we have all this information about the people who are actually the viewers themselves. And actually they had a very, very smart go-to-market strategy. They had lots and lots of different advertisement content promoting the show. And based on the specific content you had a viewer had looked at, you got fed advertising content based on the types of shows you worked for. So if you happened to had watched a lot of content with strong female characters, you got all your ads with Robin Wright. If you happened to watch a lot of political drama, you got a more generic advert about content. People who watch The West Wing got generic content about political intrigue. So there was a lot of data that they also then applied not just to the service that they created, but to the way they took that to market as well. And that's a really important factor for you to think about as you're developing new services, is what is the persona of the subscribers that are going to look to buy your service, and how should you be selling and marketing to them? So bear that in mind as well. It's not just about service definition, it's about a go-to-market strategy for the services that you have. Okay, let's turn to the service provider world. Let's talk a little bit about data that's specifically available for you as service providers. And so our premise at Calix, and I think most of you, if you're not familiar with Calix, we have been in the broadband delivery market for 20 plus years. We were at the leading edge of DSL, and now as we've seen the conversion to fiber, we're in the market of Wi-Fi delivery, so everything from the core all the way to the connection of devices to the edge. And in those 20 plus years, we've learned a lot about the information that is available to service providers in all parts of the network. And our premise is the key to understanding your subscribers is to understand how they're interacting with all those components. And we'll investigate some of those as we look at this. This little graphic is both It's both metaphorical and it's the reality. So we have at Calix, our roots are in the rural service provider. But the reality is there is a literal problem with data being stuck in silos inside service providers. Each one of these data elements that I'm showing you right here, network devices, bandwidth consumption, billing information, demographic information, that is all information that is available to service providers of all descriptions today. The reality is, though, they're all in different places in the network, and it's my data, not your data. So network devices, they belong to, hey, I'm network operations, finance, marketing, you can't touch that information. Why would you need that? You might break something. Bandwidth consumption, that might be network engineering, or network planning might want to know that. Why would marketing want to understand how much bandwidth our customers are using? Maybe they're interested in understanding if a customer's on the right service package or not, so that they can make sure they're getting a great experience. So this information is trapped in systems across the network, and there's ownership, and there's, unfortunately being a historical, no, that's my data, not your data. Or if there is this notion of sharing data, it's in a format that is irrelevant to, again, let's think about the marketers. I'm a marketer, I'm interested in understanding how much bandwidth a subscriber is using. I go to engineering and ask for a report, and they give me a report of IP addresses. Because they don't actually deal with people, they deal with IP addresses, and they don't care about geographic location or name and address. And so we end up in a situation where I've actually got some useful information as a marketer, but I still have to go transform that in some way to actually act upon that. So really, that's the problem we're working with service providers every day trying to solve for, is how do you take all these raw sources of information that are trapped inside a network, and how do you apply them to your business today? So again, this might be the kind of information that would be readily available to a marketer in an organization. They might have some demographic information. I might be able to grab some information about billing system. I might know which tier they're on, either my basic package, or they're on my premium. And I might actually even have access to a ticketing system. Have they had any trouble tickets reported? It's our view, and actually before I go there, I want to talk a little bit about Wi-Fi as well. I'll come back to the information sources. Everyone in this room, for the most part, is very lucky they're not going through the copper to fiber transformation piece of the broadband delivery challenge. Traditionally, the number one source of trouble tickets for a service provider has actually been problems with outside plant associated with the maintenance of old copper infrastructure. So those of you that have been around the industry for a while know this. A lot of that stuff was put in the ground 50 plus years ago, and that's probably being generous in some cases. And the reality is there's a raw physics problem in terms of the delivery of high amount of bandwidth over long distances over a copper infrastructure. So in a traditional copper infrastructure, a lot of the problems customers have are related to physics and plant maintenance. When you get into the fiber world, there really are no constraints, or very few constraints, in terms of the quality of broadband delivery. You essentially have a lot of infinite pipes from a bandwidth perspective, and less physical challenges. The subscriber experience shifts radically to being one of how they connect to that broadband connection. And if you look at the infographic here, today on a fiber infrastructure, over 50% of inbound calls to a service organization are going to be related to the Wi-Fi experience, not the broadband experience. 2 service providers in the last month have told me this exactly the same story. Customers come in, they've canceled their internet service, and they've called up the next day and said, what happened to my Wi-Fi? Because they actually don't realize it's the same thing. Right? So it's just, the Wi-Fi is the technology that just happens to connect people to their broadband connection. You can see from some of the data here that as well as the drivers from a support perspective, all of the new devices are not connecting via an Ethernet cable anymore. We could ask for a show of hands. Who's connecting more than one device in a home to an Ethernet cable today? One? Is the highest percentage of devices over an Ethernet cable, or are they over a Wi-Fi connection? It's almost undoubtedly a Wi-Fi connection. In fact, if you happen to consume Apple products, which I understand are fairly popular, they don't even have an Ethernet port on them. So most of the devices on this right-hand side, or your right-hand side? Yeah, your right-hand side, you can see they don't even come with the ability to connect them physically to an infrastructure anyway. They're coming with a wireless PHY. This is 2017 data. That 9.1 average device count is probably low, relatively speaking, already. So from a subscriber experience perspective, me as a service provider, now if I want to guarantee the service I'm delivering to my customers, I actually now have to start thinking about this next frontier. My service no longer ends at the demarc point on the house. I can no longer say, well, that's not my responsibility. Go to Best Buy and buy a wireless router, because the reality is their experience on your broadband connection is all about the quality of the Wi-Fi experience inside the home. So that puts even more pressure on you as a service provider to start understanding what's going on inside the premise in terms of now the types of devices and the applications and all of the other elements that kind of create these personas inside the premise. So here's a view today of types of information that service providers are collecting and actively using to start to manage the subscriber experience, and then from a prescriptive analytics perspective, try to intercept customers who might be having a bad experience or who might be interested in a new service offering way ahead of the customer realizing that they might have a problem and they are even starting to contemplate leaving. I'm going to walk through this a little bit because there's actually a lot of information on this slide. On the right-hand side in the Smith family, this is a list of information that service providers, that is either raw data sources or processed information that service providers are starting to use to help understand what might be happening inside the premise today. What kind of speed are customers subscribed to? Are they on a 25? Are they on a 1 gig package? Are they on, in this case, the Smith family are on a 6x1 service. So they're on essentially a legacy DSL service. What kind of applications are driving usage? Are they using a lot of over-the-top video? I might have a particular set of applications or an expectation of what my experience might look like if I'm an over-the-top streamer. By the way, Netflix does a really great job of making sure that even if I don't have a great broadband connection, they do a pretty good job of making sure there's no buffering on the connection, so I don't start to associate my bad experience with Netflix. I kind of defer that to the service provider. There are other applications, and I use Zoom all the time, and it's a great application, but it sucks in terms of it's a bandwidth hog, and it's super bandwidth sensitive. And guess what? It tells me every day. Every time my bandwidth starts to run out of my house, I get a note on the Zoom application that says, poor internet connection, insufficient bandwidth, and it drives me insane. I want to wring AT&T's neck every time I see because they know I'm running out of bandwidth as well. So I have an application that is very bandwidth sensitive that happens to remind me, and it's a major irritant for me, you can imagine. So the applications are important to understand, right? Because if you have subscribers, in this case, I'm this work from home, or I'm VPNing, I'm on video calls 25 hours a week. If once an hour for 25 hours a week, I get reminded I don't have enough bandwidth, I'm probably going to do something about it. How much bandwidth they're using, are they using, again, what kind of devices? So a couple of other things in here you're starting to see. Service limit hits. This is something that we talk about at Calix quite a lot. That means how many times does the customer run out of bandwidth in a given period? So how often do they hit their provision speed threshold? Now, just because they run out of speed once doesn't mean they're going to have a bad experience, but it happens consistently, then I'm probably going to want to react in some way, both as a service provider and ideally before the customer notices it and starts to react. And we're going to look at that. And as we go down this list, we can start to see that the complexity of the data is building, right? So I'm looking at, now is this customer a churn risk, right? Based on all the other data elements, is this customer likely to leave because of the types of raw data I'm now collecting, and now I can make a prediction, this customer will leave if I do nothing else. We're actually going to look at some real-life examples of how service providers are doing that. So here's our two fictitious families. We've got the Smith family and the Jones family. The Jones family, they're lucky Jones family, they're on a 1 gig service. Should be having a great experience, right? No problems. And then we've got the Paul Smith family, they're on a 25x5 service. And you can see we're collecting, the service provider in this case is collecting a lot of information and processing that. here's a view of what that information might actually look like. So this is a lens that many Calix customers are using today. And it's actually, it's what we would call a Churn Insight. And it's looking back at the last 6 months of experience of a customer that's actually left. So it's a customer's left, they're no longer in the billing system. So this tool will go back and look and it'll say, show me what the customer experience looked like for the last 6 months. So I might be able to understand, this is descriptive at this point, but if I put this together, because this is what happened, but I might be able to start build a profile that allows me to start looking for other customers in my install base that look like that so I can intercept them earlier in the process. So let me just describe the data that's here. So we look at the start at the top left. This is the amount of data that is being consumed per month by application type. So in this case, the customer is a combination of gaming and streaming. Actually, I think actually predominantly over-the-top streaming content. The top middle lens is the number of times per month they run out of bandwidth. So you can see in this case, the customer runs out of downstream bandwidth somewhere between 40 and 50 times a month on average. I would guarantee that the customer is starting to notice at this point. If it happens once a day, maybe. This is a sampling. It just so happens that the data behind this is a sampling. The reality is this is probably, they're experiencing many, many more. It just so happens that when the data is being pulled, that we're showing that the customer is running out of bandwidth. Fairly high amount of overall data usage. First kind of red flag, though, is the fact they're running out of bandwidth. The second one in this case is the service provider knows that the customer is either running speed tests or spending time on competitor websites. And that might be other service providers in the area. It might be somewhere like Broadband Now, which is an aggregator of broadband services. And if I was shopping for a new broadband service in my community, I might go to Broadband Now to understand what speeds and feeds are available and what the reputation of that service provider might look like. So it's a pretty strong indicator that someone might be about to leave your service if I've got a combination of they're having a poor experience, they're running out of bandwidth, and now I know that they're actually looking for other services. The other data element I'll just introduce here is we're also, in this case, the service provider is looking at the quality of the connection of the Wi-Fi devices in the home. So they're actually, in this case, they're looking at the number of connected devices, and they're looking at the quality of the connection of each one of those devices over a given period onto that Wi-Fi connection. So in this case, they've got an average of somewhere between 6 and 8 devices, and they've got an average Wi-Fi score of 4 out of 5. So that's generally considered good. There may be one device is over in the corner of the house isn't as well connected. Maybe it's an iPhone 4 that just doesn't have the throughput capability. But the reality is that Wi-Fi isn't a problem in this home, but the speed is. So as a sales and marketing professional, if I now understand that I have subscribers in my network that look like this, so I have this descriptive analytics data that says this is happening from a subscriber experience. If I now start to build reports and start to now look for everybody else in my network who looks the same as that, now I'm turning that descriptive into a set of prescriptive analytics capability that as a service provider, I can now intercept customers earlier in the process. This next example is a case where, again, these are real-life examples inside service providers, is a case where they had a 50 meg customer who actually they intercepted. They realized there was a problem. So if you see on the charts here, the bandwidth is going up, so top left, bandwidth is growing considerably over time. Service limit hits actually goes up in parallel. So as the customer was using more bandwidth, they were running out of that provision speed more and more. So you can see at the peak, they were 25 service limit hits in a month. The customer was also, in this case, showing they were spending a lot of time either running speed tests or on competitive websites. So the combination of these three factors would be strong predictors that the customer was going to leave. Now, in this case, they actually intercepted them and upgraded them. So in this bullet 5, they actually got the customer to upgrade from 50 to 100 meg service, but they left after 2 months anyway. So this is almost the worst case scenario. I had a customer who was unhappy. I spent money trying to save them. I made them a new offer, and then they left anyway. This is because I didn't intercept them earlier enough, right? So if I'd have got to them earlier, if I'd got to them, say, in October or November, when they first started to experience a poor experience, the likelihood of them leaving would have been far less. So Hopefully this is a good insight into how service providers are leveraging this concept of descriptive to prescriptive analytics to be able to make sure that the customer is having a great experience. Last example I'm going to share on what's happening from a service provider perspective is the Jones family. This is our 1 gig family. So this is buyer beware on people who think speed is the only answer for delivering great services. So again, this customer is using quite a lot of bandwidth. No surprise, no service limit hits. I have a 1 gig pipe. It's really hard to make that run out of bandwidth on a frequent basis. I might burst up. I might try to download a new Xbox game, but it's going to happen once, and it's going to dissipate very quickly. So in this case, this particular customer, they never ran out of bandwidth over a monthly period. The problem in this case was actually they were having a bad Wi-Fi experience. So if you can see here, they had on average about between 8 and 10 connected devices with an average Wi-Fi score of only 3. So if you do the math there, you can say maybe half of the devices had a score of less than 3, or maybe a couple of the devices had a 1 out of 5 rating. So the reality is we've got our best customer on our best service having a poor experience, and they left, right? So in this case, they ran 1 speed test, and they left a month later because they were dissatisfied. Even though they were getting the fastest available speed, they weren't having a great experience. And this is that paradigm shift of not just about providing great speed, but also providing great Wi-Fi experience on all of the devices that those customers are going to use to fulfill your broadband service. Okay, that's a little bit on the, what would I do? What are service providers doing from a sales and marketing and a response and a subscriber experience? Service providers today are also actually applying a lot of this into the tools that they're using from a customer service and support perspective. So if you can imagine, all of that complexity is changing the dynamic of the interaction between a service technician and a customer. And that complexity is actually a problem that you all need to think about addressing either as you are turning on new services or as you're starting to get into the broadband delivery business, is the complexity inside the home. It is moving at the speed of the devices that we're connected. The speed of change is not what it was when we rolled out telephone, a new telephone service. Oh, you want voicemail message indicator? Great, I'll roll that out from my Class 5 switch in 2 years, and you'll buy it when it's ready. The reality is your subscribers, the next device they go buy is going to dictate their experience that they have on your Wi-Fi connection. So that complexity is kind of illustrated here in terms of they're bringing devices into the home every day and making sure that we're leveraging some of that deep learning and machine learning capability so that we reduce the complexity for you as a service provider to be able to provide support for those. The last thing you want to do as a service provider is have to go hire 15 tier 3 technicians to be able to address the complexity of the devices and applications that your customers are using in the home, especially if you're not planning to monetize that. So this is another view on how service providers are collecting information. And historically, if someone called in, I'd phone up my service provider and say, okay, let's go through a troubleshooting process. It's kind of going to look like this, right? I'm going to start asking you questions. I have a little bit of information about the service you're on. I don't have a single pane of glass traditionally to be able to look at what your experience is inside the home. And the reality is that it's on average somewhere between 21 and 27 minutes to troubleshoot a broadband-related problem if it is not passed off to another technician. Maybe and by the way, every time you hand off a customer to somebody else, the risk of their dissatisfaction going up is radically increased, because then they've got to start again and they've got to talk to someone, and guess what? People don't like talking to people. They would rather just, what the problem is and you could diagnose it. So the reality is that, again, service providers need to be thinking about how do I take all this data that I've got today and how do I take advantage of the probes that I now have in that environment, and then how do I actually start to divide the labor up more effectively? And I think, we heard this from Thomas yesterday, jobs aren't going away, they're changing, right? So now let's make AI and the data actually determine what the problem is, and then let my customer service people work on making sure that my customers are having the best possible experience, right? So how can we start to use instrumentation and analytics to actually solve problems faster and more effectively? And here's an example of some tools that service providers are using where they're essentially, the data is being processed automatically by, essentially in this case, a support application. It's highlighting where there are problems. I'm not reliant on my mother describing how the lights are flashing on the wireless router or not, or the fact they're not flashing at all, right? So I can now use the data that's available from these devices to inform me as a service provider what's going on. And if I'm really smart, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to actually let the network autonomously manage itself. Right? I'm actually going to start building, via machine learning, some capability that's going to tell the network inside the home to respond based on certain conditions. If I see lots of Wi-Fi interference, automatically change the channel so that the customer doesn't notice that there's a problem because someone just bought a new baby monitor in the house. So the reality is there's lots of ways now that by leveraging data, analytics, and AI, we can now start to really streamline the way that we support customers from a reactive response, as they call in, from a service perspective. And then the final example I've got here is another use case on how service providers are using data and analytics. Network planning. So where do I need to build capacity, right? So if I think about each one of those individual subscribers that are running out of bandwidth, there was an assumption that I have capacity to sell them. What if I don't have capacity, right? So I want to actually take all that information now and I want to hand that back to my network planning team and my build teams and say, okay, these are the areas where I actually have concentrations of subscribers whose needs are underserved, right? So we can see here a couple of views here. I've got all these green and blue dots. These indicate active subscribers, and they indicate those that have an adequate service provision service for their needs versus those that don't. And then I can draw a little heat map. I can say, okay, I now know that in these areas where I've got high concentrations of subscribers with unmet needs, I actually need to go start taking that information and start to use that in my network build model. This is exactly the same set of information, right? All I'm doing is I'm turning it around and saying, who are the people that need an upgrade and can get one, right? And I'm going to give that to sales and marketing, and they're going to go off and they're going to act on that. And I'm taking the same data and I'm saying, okay, network planning from a network optimization perspective, this is where we now need to build capacity next if we're going to make sure our customers are getting the best possible experience on our infrastructure. So it's really, when we start to think about data, we're also starting to think about how do I package that up in a format that allows a specific functional line of business the necessary insights for them to respond immediately without having to process the data in any significant way, or have to spend resources or cycle or time to be able to get to the point where I can actually make a business decision. So I'm just kind of starting to wrap up now. So really, we looked at the journey of descriptive to prescriptive. There's also this element of collecting data, organizing and analyzing, and then actually creating business insights. And ultimately, that's the journey you want to go to. There are lots of people in the industry that are already there to help. I guarantee we're all at some level in the room using Excel spreadsheets today. It's a great way to collect information and actually do some level of processing. But the reality is that we actually want to start turning that raw data into meaningful insights that we can actually start to make decisions around. And so there's a progression. We talked about Tableau, right? The fact that Tableau just got acquired by Salesforce. Good news for us, we're a Salesforce customer already. We use Tableau at Calix for other purposes, but there are others, and I actually think there's going to continue to be consolidation in this space as we start to see more and more of these big data companies realize that in order to unlock the value, they actually need to start putting these other tools in place to allow customers to organize and analyze the data. So kind of in summary, so from an analytics strategy perspective, right, there's a lot of data that's in your network that you need to start thinking about getting. And if you're starting fresh today, the good news is there's going to be a lot of help for you. in the situation service providers were 10 years ago, where they really were trying to start building this from nothing. There was a proliferation of spend on data warehouses and data scientists in the service provider community about 10 years ago, because they realized they didn't have the tools they needed. The reality is there's a lot of help off the shelf for you as a new provider today. You want to think about unlocking the data. We use the word democratizing it, so how do I make it useful for everybody? So my data is not my data, it's our data, and make sure that we're sharing. We have a strategy to make sure that if I have something that's of use to you in another part of the business that helps you be more effective, we make it accessible and easy from an insights perspective. And then, as we saw in those last couple of examples, data needs to be presented in a way that is meaningful for a specific line of business. So if I'm a financier, or I'm a marketer, or I'm a network operations manager, I actually need what will look like the very same sources of raw data, but the way that needs to be actually processed and presented to me needs to look different. So if you don't remember anything else from the presentation today, be prepared to break down silos of data. And be confident in leveraging it to drive business decisions. It still drives me insane. Sometimes I see customers who have a strategy and they only look at the data that affirms the strategy that they've already decided. It's like, that's not smart thinking. You should allow the data to dictate the strategy at one level and also the next best action, right? So, and then I wrap up here. So your data will be the voice of your customer now if you're willing to listen. So with that, thank you for your time this morning. I'll be at the booth with the rest of the Calix team for most of the morning. If you have any questions, I'd be delighted to help out. Thanks for your time today.